Recently, I've been reading Legends and Lattes, which is what people have referred to as a cozy fantasy, which is kind of a very odd genre that I've never actually heard of before. Now, realistically, what it means is it's not that long. It's not that broad. It's not got some massive big adventure where people go off into massive lands they've never heard of before, and there's big words and big names and things you've never heard of before. It's all relatively simple in what it's doing. It's all focused around a coffee shop. Now, I'm not going to be talking about this book, but what it got me into thinking was this is a short fantasy book. We are talking about 320, less than 320 pages. The audiobook is about 7.5, 8 hours long, which is really short for a fantasy novel. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to go and on my bookshelf over to the left of me, I wanted to find some fantasy books that won't take you weeks to read, that you don't need to spend the first 100 pages getting into the back history and the dialogue of, because they just jump straight into the action. They're either going to not take you weeks to read, they'll take you a few days, or they're less than 400 pages or less than 500 pages long, and you should really enjoy them. So let's get into this list now, because I think hopefully this should help those also that aren't into fantasy yet and want to get into fantasy, kind of make that first small step into, okay, where should I start with fantasy novels? So let's get into the list now. So I'm going to try and start off with the easiest book, as it were, and then work my way slowly increasing in complexity to the final book, which then none of them are complex, because I want this video to very much be a case of, okay, if you have never tried fantasy before, these are some great book recommendations. So my first recommendation is Scythe by Neil Shusterman, and the whole series really. Now, Scythe in itself is a great first book to get into. We're looking at not too big a book here. Now, some of these books are going to look big. Some are going to have 400 plus pages, but you look at the size of the writing in this book and you look at the gaps in between the lines, and you can quickly see this is written for kind of a YA audience. This is written for a younger audience. This isn't written for some old, deep, I don't know, 30-year-old bloke that loves reading 600, 700, 800, 900,000 page fantasies. Scythe is a really simple and nice entry into the fantasy genre. Now, Scythe could arguably be put into science fiction, and it is kind of science fiction because there's not a lot of fantasy, but listen to the premise and let me know your thoughts. So Scythe essentially is the story of what would happen if nobody could die anymore. Humanity cannot die anymore. Therefore, what humanity has decided to do is appoint these people called Scythes to go out and kill people at complete random. Now, what then happens and comes along is two young people who decide to kind of rebel against this idea and go back to a more sensible way of doing things and start to make kind of big waves in this. Now, the concept of humanity not being able to die and people having it decided for them when they're going to die is a really interesting concept, and the writing's really easy. As I said, this very much feels like it was written for a YA, which is young adult, but don't worry, if you are 40, 50 years old and getting into fantasy now, all that means is it's not too complicated a writing. It's not going to break your vocabulary walls. It's going to be really easy to read. You're going to rush through it, and it's a really, really nice book. And there are 2 follow-up books which are great as well. So I think Scythe is probably the best in the series. The second one is also great, and then the third is unfortunately a little bit underwhelming. But if you're into the world and you're into the idea of the concept of this, buy book 1 and book 2. You'll enjoy all 3 of them. So I think Scythe is my first recommendation. It's a really, really good kind of first introduction into fantasy / sci-fi if you've never read anything in that genre before. So the next book is one you may not have heard of. So Scythe is fairly popular, this one not so much. And there is this series to this, and I'm very limited in my knowledge of this because I read this a long time ago, kind of in passing, and have not yet read the sequels and all the follow-up books, despite the fact I've bought like the whole series. So this is Summoner the Novice. So there's a series called Summoner, and this first one's called The Novice. Now, in short, this is kind of like if Pokemon made a fiction fantasy book. Therefore, it's aimed at that kind of audience. It's not quite for young people, but it is for kind of your young adults, people who are now probably grew up with Pokemon, maybe a bit younger, I don't know. I enjoyed it. But essentially, this young boy goes to a school, and at the school, you are given a animal creature sort of thing, and that creature then fights for you, and you can go through in battle and defend yourself. And there's bullying, and there's kind of, he has to rise up, he has to prove himself, and all this sort of stuff, the cliche stuff you get in these kind of novels. But it's a really, really nice introduction into that kind of side of things. Now, this specific version I've got has got something called a demonology in it, which I think, yeah, essentially means what you've got is you've got drawings of these creatures and what they are and what they can do and that sort of stuff. The classification, the summoning level, the base mana level, the mana abilities. So it's quite nerdy. So if you're into your kind of, I like Pokemon because I like to know how much HP and all of that stuff they've got, this is a great recommendation for you. So just pushing it closer, I realise I'm stood quite far back from the camera, but Summoner, and this is by Taran Mataru. A name, I don't know if he's done anything else, I'm not sure if he's done anything else, but there is a whole series of them, and they were, where are they? I can't find them on my bookshelf. So this is like the third book. I think I've got the second book down on this. So this bookshelf you see behind me is my TBR shelf. So it's down there somewhere. I've got the second book on there as well. And they all kind of follow the same concept of there are creatures that we can summon and we can use them to fight other things. So that's cool. That's a nice little introduction. That's Summoner the Novice. One boy's power to summon demons will change the fate of an empire by Taran Mataru or Matharu, I don't know. Check it out. This often is quite cheap as well on like your Amazons and your secondhand books and stuff like that. So it might be a really, really good introduction. And in terms of length, what are we looking at here? We're looking at, not including the demonology at the back, where it doesn't have page numbers. It does. We're looking at less than 360 pages. Again, fairly big writing, fairly big lines in between the text. So yeah, enjoy yourself with this one. So that's Summoner the Novice. How many times do I have to say that? A lot, apparently. Okay, so now we're getting into more of the slightly nerdier stuff. So this is Iron Widow by Chiran J. Tsao. Now, I actually read this one earlier this year, and it genuinely might be in contention for one of my top 10 books of the year because it was just so fun in such a short amount of space of time. So this really is quite nerdy. So essentially what we've got here is it's obviously Asian inspired. The author is Asian. The front cover is kind of like an Asian inspired art based around the idea that human beings can control these massive mecha bots to fight these aliens, and the mecha bots are powered by their chi, which is essentially their willpower, and then they use females as like a spare part in the robot to suck their chi and potentially kill them if they need them to defeat these aliens. Mental premise. Absolutely love the idea, not because I approve, but just because it's such a crazy idea. So obviously our story is about a woman who one day, her sister is actually killed in this situation, and she wants to rise up and fight back and become one of these riders of these massive mecha bot creatures and rise up against the politics and the drama and everything and show that women can be just as powerful, and it's all a myth that women can't be as powerful and they have to just be these kind of co-pilots. It was so fun. Everybody that I've kind of recommended this book to has said this was just an absolute blast. There's something about the way that it's written. It's almost Brandon Sanderson-esque in that it doesn't mess around with kind of telling you backstory and messing around with like over describing things. It's just like the bot fought this thing and then she jumped out and did this and then she said this, and it's just snap, snap, snap. And it may look, again, it may not look that thin. This isn't like a 200-page book. And it actually has it has way under 400 pages in here. And again, is another fairly short read in terms of fancy. We're not talking hundreds of pages here. This is less than 400 pages. And I was shocked because I was listening to the audiobook for quite a lot of it, and I thought this has got so much more to go. I could read this for another 2-3 days long. And then it just kind of finished, and it was like, wow, there's going to be a plot, and there's like this big unspoken thing at the end, and this plot twist at the end. It's fantastic. Really, really was enjoyable. Fantastic art. It's the debut novel. I know there's a second one either coming out or is to come out very, very soon or has come out recently. Either way, I think you should definitely be checking this out. So this is Iron Widow by Chiran J. Tsao, which I think is just such a blast. It's really, really fun introduction to fantasy. I know a lot of people that haven't read proper, like dark, you know, your Bransons, Sansons, John Gwynne, your Tolkiens, your Robin Hobbs sort of fantasy, but have read this and really, really enjoyed it because it's just so far-fetched and so fun. It's like, okay, we're getting around the concept of mecha bots, people riding them, they're powered by their willpower. Get past that and it's just a great fun time. So that's Iron Widow by Chiran J. Tsao. Another read for me this year was Godkiller by Hannah Kaner. Now this is a book that again I saw quite a bit of hype from. I think all my book recommendations of people on social media. So Godkiller follows essentially a woman called Kissen who goes out and she kills gods. Now gods aren't quite the same as what they are and what we imagine them to be, these ethereal beings. They are just, imagine Witcher, where she goes out and she has these specific things that she requires, these specific garments and specific gadgets bandits and things that she needs to go out and kill them, and she kills them for coin. She then goes out and meets a woman who has a god attached to her very soul that means that she can't be released from her, and they can't get that far apart, and the god is the god of white lies, so loves to tell people little white lies and lets them get away with loads of things. She wants to separate them. There's a bigger story that goes on here. There's bigger things that happen, and again, it's a really short fantasy novel. Now, these sort of things really shock me when they're these short, because I really worry with a fantasy novel, you can't build the world out, you can't build the characters out, you can't make these epic wars happen in such a few amount of pages. But you really could in God Willing. Now, there aren't any epic wars, but it does everything else. There is a journey, there are multiple characters, there is backstory, there's history, there's world to be built, and it's really, really interesting. So that's God Killer by Hannah Craner. And again, what are we looking at here? We're looking at sub 300 pages. Now, the writing's not big in this one. You do have quite small writing on this one, but again, it didn't take me longer than 10 hours to get through the audiobook of this one. So that's God Killer by Hannah Craner, another short fancy recommendation I'd really recommend into. So this is my 4th of 5th book I'm recommending. So this one is quite kind of proper fantasy. So this could have easily been a 400, 500, 670 page, 700 page novel about fantasy. It just decided to be shorter. So in a lot of fantasies, you get multiple kind of plots that happen within them, which keep them longer. This just stuck to the kind of first and second plot maybe within the book. Another really, really good read, another great fantasy, another one that's not going to take you weeks to read. And then my final book, so the 5th book in this list of recommendations of short fantasy books you can get into, whether you like fantasy or not, is The Return of the Knights by Gregory Contaxis. Now, this is an indie published smaller book. This isn't as well known. You may have heard of those previous ones. You may have seen them around. This one you may not have. This is one that was personally sent to me by Gregory, and it is brilliant. It really, really is fantastic. And the bonus on why it's on this list is it's not even 400 pages long. Now, it's quite a big book. Like, if we compare it to God Killer, it is quite a big boy, but realistically it's still not a long read. I managed to read this. I actually physically sat down and read this because there isn't an audiobook for it, so I physically sat down and read it, and I probably would say it took me maybe 11-12 hours to read. A really, really short, snappy, brilliant fantasy book that does all the things that you'd expect from a proper fantasy. And I'm saying proper, I don't mean that in a demeaning way to this book. I mean the word proper in just the, I don't know, 800-900 pages that you'd expect from a fantasy book. It covers the big, broad world. It has history. It has your cool villains. It has your cool characters. It has politics. It has different lands that are visited. It has this kind of deep, streaking, long history that we can talk about, and it kind of building up this world. And I've got the sequel to read, which I'm really, really excited to read. It's got a big dragon on it as well, which is sick. This is another fantastic fantasy book that doesn't take long to read. So this one covers the story of a young man called Elliot who just suddenly appears one day and appears to have this incredible ability to fight and use these powers, and is very young and very interesting. And then he gets himself entangled with the Queen. The Queen is under threat from one of the most ruthless men of all time, who's taking over the rest of the land and is coming for her land. This boy called Elliot comes up with a plan to essentially stop him, and everybody says it's stupid, it's never going to happen, nobody can do that, and he essentially can do that and does it. And it's really, really interesting, and I loved it, and I would highly recommend it. It's also got really cool front cover. I imagine at some point this is going to get picked up by a bigger publisher just because it's that cool and that impressive. So if you've not yet had a chance to read The Return of the Knights by Gregory Contaxis, I would definitely recommend it. It's a very, very impressive kind of novel. And as I said, it's not going to take you too long either. And the second book isn't that long either. And there's also a novella. Now, the novella, I will admit, I wasn't as big a fan of as this. I felt like it was too short, too snappy, didn't get time to do stuff. This one did. This one's brilliant. So that's my 5th and final recommendation of short fantasy books that I think you would easily be able to get into if you've never read a fantasy book before. So those are my 5 fantasy books that I would recommend you kind of get into if you've not yet read any fantasy. And even if you have read fantasy and you're thinking, well, I do want to pick something else up, but I don't want it to take me weeks, these are also fantastic recommendations. So we've got Scythe by Neil Shusterman, we've got Summoner by Taran Macharu, we've got Iron Widow by Jiran J. Tsao, we've got God Killer by Hannah Craner, and we've got The Return of the Knights by Gregory Contaxis as my 5 recommendations for books that if you have not got into fantasy yet, or if you are just buzzing about fantasy but want to read something short, I would recommend you get into. None of them are going to take you that long at all, and they're all fantastic reads in their own right. Let me know if you've got any other recommendations down below. I've got some other books that I think I could have included here, but I don't have physical copies of, so wouldn't have made as great video. Like Piranesi was a good one. And then there's some kind of novellas as well, which are quite good. I read the novella of Ryan Cahill, which I can't remember what that was called, but was really, really impressive. I'll pop it here now. That was impressive for a novella as well. I think my brother's got that at the moment, so that's quite good. So novellas are quite good for fantasy if you don't mind not having the world building, you just want the action. Either way, let me know your recommendations down below. Until then, I will see you in the next video. Don't forget to subscribe, like, thank you for watching, and goodbye.